She built a $1 billion bank, but had no idea it was built on discrimination. When she walked into her own branch, they treated her like she didn't belong. That was their first mistake. Their second, thinking she wouldn't fight back. But she wasn't just going to take down one man. She was going to tear the whole system apart. And when the dust settled, banking would never be the same again. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The early morning light streamed through the towering glass windows of Langston and Company's headquarters, casting long shadows across the sleek marble floors. The city outside was alive. Yellow cabs honked impatiently, pedestrians rushed to work, and the hum of New York's financial district buzzed just beyond the walls. Inside, however, a different kind of energy filled the air, one laced with tension and anticipation. Victoria Langston stepped off the private elevator, her heels clicking sharply against the polished surface. She carried herself with the composed confidence of a woman who had built her empire against the odds. At 51, she had seen more than her fair share of boardrooms filled with men who doubted her, who questioned her every move, not because of incompetence, but because of who she was. A black woman at the helm of one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country. She adjusted the cuff of her tailored navy blazer, exhaling softly before pushing open the grand double doors of the boardroom. Inside, a dozen executives sat at the long mahogany table, their eyes shifting towards her as she entered. Some acknowledged her with nods, others offered stiff smiles, but a few barely concealed their skepticism. "Gentlemen, ladies," Victoria greeted, taking her seat at the head of the table. At the center of today's agenda was an issue she had been pushing for months: the expansion of financial services into lower-income communities, particularly in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. Too often, these communities had been systematically excluded from fair banking opportunities, locked out of the very wealth-building tools that others took for granted. The discussion began smoothly enough, with a few cautious acknowledgments of the idea's merit, but it wasn't long before resistance surfaced. "We need to be realistic, Victoria," Charles Whitman, one of the older board members, said as he adjusted his tie. "The risk factor in these areas is considerably higher. We'd be dealing with lower credit scores, irregular incomes. The potential for default is something we can't ignore. And not to mention," another executive chimed in, "we have shareholders who expect strong returns. Expanding into these areas might not be the most responsible financial move." Victoria interlaced her fingers, keeping her expression neutral. She had heard this argument before. So many times it had nearly become predictable. "I understand concerns about risk," she said evenly, "but what I don't understand is why we continue to operate under the assumption that these communities are inherently unprofitable. We're looking at a market that has been underserved for decades. If anything, that's an opportunity, one that benefits both the business and the people it serves." There were murmurs around the table. A few nodded, but others exchanged skeptical glances. A younger board member, Charles's protege, leaned forward. "But are these communities even looking for banking solutions from us? Many of them operate on cash, alternative lending, even credit unions. Is it worth investing resources where they may not even want our services?" Victoria inhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "They want fair treatment. They want the same opportunities others have. And if they haven't turned to us before, maybe it's because we haven't given them a reason to trust us." Silence settled over the room. It wasn't just about business. It was about systemic barriers that had been in place for generations. Victoria had spent her career breaking through them, proving her worth over and over again in an industry that had never been designed for people like her. And now, even as CEO, she still had to fight for what should have been obvious: fairness. But she could feel the reluctance in the air. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about the ingrained resistance to change, the unspoken preference for maintaining the status quo. After an hour of debate, the meeting adjourned with no real conclusion. The executives filed out, some lingering in hushed conversations, while Victoria remained seated, tapping her fingers against the polished wood. As the room emptied, she let out a slow breath. This was her company. Her name was on the building. Yet at this moment, she felt like she was losing control of it. Her thoughts drifted to something she hadn't done in years: Fieldwork. There was a time when she had built her understanding of finance from the ground up, meeting with real people, hearing their struggles firsthand. Maybe it was time to go back to that. A decision solidified in her mind. She would go to one of their branches, not as CEO, not with the weight of her title, just as a regular customer. She wanted to see for herself how these communities were really being treated. Pulling out her phone, she sent a quick message to her assistant. "Book me a flight to Atlanta. I'll handle the rest." As she stood and gathered her belongings, she cast one last glance at the empty boardroom. "If I can't change this system from the inside," she murmured to herself, "then who will?" She squared her shoulders and walked out, already knowing that this trip was going to change everything. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the faint hum of conversations drifting through the bank lobby. The interior was pristine, glass walls, polished floors, and sleek counters lined with digital screens displaying exchange rates and promotional offers. At first glance, the branch looked like any other high-end banking establishment, but Victoria Langston wasn't here to admire the decor. She adjusted the strap of her leather handbag, blending in as just another customer. Her outfit was deliberately chosen: simple slacks, a well-fitted cardigan over a plain blouse, and comfortable flats. No designer labels, no power suit, nothing that would draw unnecessary attention. This wasn't a CEO's visit. This was a test. She scanned the space, quickly noticing the unspoken rules of engagement. To her left, a designated priority service section housed plush leather chairs, where well-dressed, mostly white clients were being attended to swiftly. To the right, a queue stretched from the main service counter, a line made up mostly of Black and Latino customers, all waiting patiently while tellers handled their transactions at a noticeably slower pace. Victoria took a deep breath and stepped forward to one of the main counters. A middle-aged teller greeted her with a polite but rehearsed smile. Before she could speak, a deep voice interrupted. "Excuse me, ma'am." Victoria turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive charcoal gray suit stepping toward her. His smile was tight, his gaze scrutinizing. Mark Holloway. She recognized him instantly from her internal memos. The branch manager, a man with an impressive track record on paper, but one whose customer service ratings among minority clients were consistently low. "I'm the branch manager here," he continued, clasping his hands together as if addressing a problem before it could escalate. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Yes," Victoria replied, keeping her tone even. "I'd like to make a withdrawal." Mark glanced at her attire before shifting his gaze to the teller, giving a barely perceptible nod. The woman at the counter hesitated, then excused herself to the back office. Victoria noticed. "So," Mark said, turning his attention back to her, "what amount are we talking about?" $50,000. The silence that followed was brief but telling. A flicker of something crossed Mark's face. Suspicion, skepticism, then a forced chuckle. "That's quite a sum," he said. "May I see your ID?" Victoria handed him her driver's license, watching his expression carefully as he studied it. He flipped it over, examined the details, then handed it back, only to extend his hand again. "I'll also need proof of funds," he added, his voice pleasant but firm. Victoria raised a brow. "Excuse me?" "Standard protocol for large cash withdrawals," he explained. "We need to verify the source of income. You understand, of course." She did understand. She also knew that this wasn't standard protocol at all. A well-dressed man at the priority counter had just walked out with a withdrawal that large, if not more, without a single question asked. She had watched it happen 10 minutes ago. Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Are you asking every customer for proof of funds, or just me?" Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's just a routine check. If you don't have the necessary documentation, I'm afraid we can't proceed." She caught movement from the corner of her eye, a junior employee, watching the exchange with clear discomfort, but no one spoke up. Then she heard it. Mark, lowering his voice as he turned slightly to one of his employees. "Keep an eye on her. Transactions like this usually mean fraud." Victoria's fingers curled around the edge of the counter. He thought she was a criminal, not because of her actions, not because of her account history, but because of what he saw when he looked at her. She exhaled slowly. She had expected bias, but this was blatant. A few feet away, another woman shifted in her chair. Victoria's eyes flicked toward her. A black woman in her early 40s, dressed in a professional emerald blazer, a folder of financial documents resting on her lap. She looked familiar, and then Victoria remembered. Angela Brooks, a small business owner. Her loan application had been flagged in internal reports for unexplained delays. 3 months pending, no clear reason. Angela must have recognized what was happening because their eyes met for a brief second. She seemed as if she wanted to say something, but instead she looked away, adjusting her papers as if suddenly finding them fascinating. Victoria understood. This wasn't just about one transaction. It wasn't just about her. She straightened, sliding her ID back into her wallet. Mark smiled, thinking he had won. She returned the expression with one of her own, calm and unreadable. "That's fine," she said. "I'll come back later." And with that, she turned and walked out. As she stepped into the cool Atlanta air, she kept her face impassive. But inside something churned. If this could happen to her, CEO of this very bank, then what was happening to everyone else? Victoria stepped outside the bank, inhaling deeply as the humid Atlanta air filled her lungs. She adjusted the strap of her purse, making it seem as though she were checking her phone. In reality, she was lingering, watching. From where she stood near the entrance, she had a clear view of the bank's interior through the glass walls. People moved in and out, some greeted warmly, others barely acknowledged. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge, ones she had suspected but now saw with undeniable clarity. A white couple entered, dressed in casual business attire. Within seconds, a teller greeted them with a bright smile, leading them toward the priority service area. Less than 5 minutes later, they were seated, being offered bottled water while their paperwork was processed. A black woman, carrying a sleeping toddler on her hip, stepped up to the main counter. She shifted the child's weight from one arm to another while trying to hand the teller a check. The teller barely looked up, tapping at the keyboard with deliberate slowness before disappearing into the back without a word. The woman sighed, bouncing her child gently as she shifted on her feet, waiting. Victoria's stomach tightened. She wasn't alone in noticing the disparity. Inside, behind the main service counter, a young teller glanced at the waiting woman, his expression uneasy. James Carter, she recalled from personnel files, a promising junior employee with a clean record. He looked like he wanted to say something, but Mark Holloway, standing a few feet away, gave him a sharp glance. James immediately looked down and continued processing the transaction in front of him. That confirmed it. Mark wasn't just allowing this treatment, he was orchestrating it. Victoria exhaled slowly, pushing aside the anger rising within her. Losing her temper wouldn't serve her. If she wanted to fix this, she needed to see how deep the problem ran. She turned back toward the entrance and stepped inside. The air conditioning hit her immediately, a stark contrast to the heat outside. As she moved through the bank, she caught sight of Angela Brooks still sitting in the waiting area, flipping through a stack of neatly organized papers. Victoria took a seat beside her. "Still waiting?" she asked casually. Angela blinked in surprise before recognition settled in. "Yeah," she sighed, setting the papers on her lap. "It's been 3 months. They keep asking for more documents. I've given them everything. Tax records, business plans, even personal statements. But every time I think I'm done, there's another request." Victoria frowned. "And the reason?" Angela let out a dry chuckle. "They never give me one. Just that they need further review. Meanwhile, I watched a guy come in last week, apply, and walk out with an approval in an hour. He didn't even have half the paperwork I do." Victoria studied her. Angela's frustration wasn't just about the delay. It was about the unspoken truth behind it. "You ever think about going to a different bank?" Angela's expression turned wry. "You think this is just a problem here? I've been to 3 different banks in the past year, all with the same results. Either I get strung along until I give up, or I get denied outright. I know I'm not their ideal customer. Doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying." Her words settled deep in Victoria's chest. She had fought her entire career to build this bank into an institution that stood for more than just profit. She had believed that her presence at the top meant real change, that her leadership had shaped an inclusive environment. But here, In this very branch, her own name carried no weight. It wasn't just one manager. It wasn't just one location. Had her influence been nothing more than an illusion? Victoria smoothed the fabric of her cardigan, keeping her expression composed. "I hope they don't keep you waiting much longer," she said, rising to her feet. Angela nodded, offering a tight but appreciative smile. Victoria turned, moving toward the exit once more. But she wasn't leaving. She took a position near the side of the lobby where she could observe unnoticed. For the next half hour, she watched as customer after customer came and went. The pattern was unmistakable. White customers were met with efficiency, warmth, and priority service. Black and Latino customers faced delays, scrutiny, and unexplained hurdles. Victoria had seen enough. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. This wasn't just one corrupt manager. This was the system, and she was going to dismantle it. Victoria took a slow step toward the waiting area, keeping her posture relaxed as if she were simply stretching her legs. But her ears were sharp, attuned to the quiet exchanges happening behind the sleek counters. She knew what she was listening for: hesitation, nervousness, the cracks in a system that tried too hard to appear seamless. From her position near a tall potted plant, she caught a conversation at the far end of the counter. "Mark, the Brooks loan file has everything," a low voice muttered. Victoria glanced sideways. James Carter, the junior banker from earlier. He stood stiffly, gripping a manila folder close to his chest as he spoke to Mark Holloway in hushed tones. "She's met every requirement," James continued. "Tax returns, business history, personal credit score. Everything checks out. So why are we still stalling?" Mark leaned in slightly, his lips curling into a smug smile as he spoke just loud enough for James to hear, but not the customers. "Because I don't like risk, James," he said smoothly. "And if she gives up, we don't have to take any." Victoria felt a slow burn build in her chest. Risk. That word had been used as a weapon for decades, a blanket excuse to justify keeping resources out of the hands of those who needed them most. She stayed where she was, watching as James hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. His grip on the folder tightened, but he didn't push further. He merely swallowed hard, nodded stiffly, and walked back toward his workstation. Victoria exhaled, keeping her expression neutral. She already had her answer. This wasn't incompetence. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was policy. She shifted her focus toward the entrance as a middle-aged white man stepped inside, wearing an expensive watch and carrying a leather briefcase. Within seconds, a teller greeted him with a bright smile. "Good morning, sir. What can we do for you today?" "I need a loan," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "A small one. Just a business expansion." Victoria tilted her head slightly, listening. "Of course," the teller replied, immediately pulling up a form on the computer. "Do you have your basic paperwork with you?" "Not all of it," the man admitted, tapping his fingers on the counter. "I don't have last year's tax statements on me, but I can get them later if needed." The teller nodded. "That's not a problem. We can move forward with the pre-approval process now and finalize the rest once you bring those in." Victoria's grip tightened on her bag strap. That was it. No hoops to jump through. No back and forth. No endless waiting. Angela Brooks, a black woman with a complete application, had been waiting 3 months for an answer. This man, without all his documents, was moving forward in minutes. The message was clear. Who you were mattered more than what you brought to the table. Victoria took a slow, measured breath. She needed proof. Casually, she slid her phone from her purse, angling it subtly so that the microphone faced the counter. She tapped the screen, activating the voice recorder, then let the phone rest in her palm as she walked toward the row of pamphlets along the wall. From this position, she had a clear line of sight to Mark Holloway, still chatting quietly with another employee, oblivious to her actions. Victoria listened, the recorder capturing everything. Mark's dismissive tone, the double standard unfolding before her eyes, the manufactured roadblocks put in place to make customers like Angela Brooks give up. She let the recording run for several minutes before tapping the screen again, stopping it. Then, without hesitation, she pulled out her phone's messaging app and typed a quick note. "I need a full report on loan approvals from this branch. Breakdown by race, amount, and approval time. Pull the last 12 months. Send it by tonight." She hit send. A moment later, a response popped up. On it! Victoria felt a slow, cold satisfaction settle in her chest. Now she had more than just a feeling. She had data, and soon she would have enough to expose it all. But first, she needed to make Holloway sweat. She turned and walked straight to the counter, this time deliberately catching Mark's attention. He raised an eyebrow as she approached, his mouth curling into a smirk. "I thought you had left," he said, his tone laced with condescension. Victoria met his gaze head-on, tilting her head slightly as if amused. Then she smiled. "I'm just getting started." Mark's smirk faltered, if only for a split second. Victoria didn't hesitate. She walked back toward the counter with a steady pace, her heels clicking softly against the polished tile floor. She wasn't here to play along anymore. Mark Holloway looked up from his computer screen, his smirk vanishing the moment he saw her. His expression shifted from surprise to irritation, his fingers pausing mid-keystroke. "You're back," he said, his tone carrying a forced politeness that didn't quite mask the condescension beneath it. Victoria met his gaze head-on. "I am." Mark let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Look, ma'am," he said, deliberately emphasizing the word, "I already explained our policies to you. We have the right to deny transactions if we find them inappropriate or suspicious." His voice was smooth, calculated, loud enough for the employees behind the counter to hear, but low enough that it still held the illusion of discretion. A few heads turned in their direction. Customers waiting in line began to take notice. Victoria didn't flinch. "Suspicious," she repeated, letting the words settle between them. "Tell me, Mr. Holloway, what exactly about my transaction raised red flags?" Mark leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, his smile tight. "Ma'am, we follow protocols. We verify large withdrawals to ensure there's no fraud involved. You understand how financial security works, don't you?" Victoria nodded slowly. "Of course, but I just watched a gentleman walk out of here 10 minutes ago with a loan approved on the spot. No extra paperwork. No unnecessary scrutiny." Mark's jaw twitched. She continued, keeping her tone even. "Meanwhile, Angela Brooks, a small business owner, has been waiting 3 months for an answer on her loan. She has everything in order. So tell me, Mr. Holloway, why does it take her months while others walk in and out within minutes?" The tension in the room shifted. A few customers in the waiting area turned their heads toward the counter, watching the conversation unfold. Employees behind the glass partitions exchanged wary glances. Mark forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "I'm afraid you're making some assumptions here, ma'am." Victoria didn't blink. "No, I'm making an observation." Mark's fingers drummed against the counter. "We have procedures," he said, his voice firmer now. "Some customers have stronger credit histories than others. It's not personal, it's just business." Victoria took a step closer. "So you're saying that every black customer who walks through these doors just happens to have weaker credit than the white customers you approve immediately?" Silence. Mark's nostrils flared slightly. He was trying to keep his composure, but she saw it, the flicker of discomfort, the momentary shift in his eyes. Behind him, James Carter, the young banker from earlier, stiffened. Victoria turned her attention to him. "James," she said, her voice cutting through the charged atmosphere. He froze. His gaze darted between her and Mark. "What do you think?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Am I being treated unfairly?" James's throat bobbed. He hesitated, glancing at Mark, who narrowed his eyes, a silent warning. For a second, it looked like James might speak. His lips parted, but then he looked down at his desk, busying himself with some imaginary task. Victoria nodded, her expression unreadable. "I see." Mark exhaled, his confidence returning. "Ma'am, if you have concerns, I suggest you file a complaint through the proper channels. Otherwise, I'm afraid I can't help you." A lesser woman might have let it go. Victoria reached into her bag, appearing to adjust the contents. In reality, her fingers pressed against her phone's screen, discreetly hitting the record button before slipping it back into her pocket. She smiled at Mark, slow and knowing. "That won't be necessary," she said smoothly. Mark looked slightly thrown off. "Excuse me?" Victoria adjusted the strap of her purse and stepped back. "I just needed to hear it for myself." She turned on her heel and walked away, the air buzzing with unspoken tension. Mark watched her go, the smirk creeping back onto his face. He thought he had won, but Victoria Langston had just begun. Victoria stepped out of the bank, the humid Atlanta air pressing against her skin. The tension from inside still clung to her like an unwelcome weight, but she didn't let it show. She walked with the same measured confidence she always carried, her pace steady, her posture upright. Mark Holloway thought he had shut her down. He was wrong. Sliding into the back seat of her car, she pulled the door shut and took a moment, exhaling through her nose. The engine hummed as the driver waited for instructions, but she wasn't ready to leave just yet. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen, dialing a number she knew by heart. A crisp voice answered almost immediately. Langston and Company, Internal Audit. This is Decker. Victoria didn't waste time. I need a full statistical breakdown of loan approvals for all branches. Nationwide. Specifically, I want to see approval rates segmented by race, loan amount, and time to approval. There was a brief pause on the other end. That's a big ask, ma'am. Do we have a particular region in mind? Victoria's grip on her phone tightened. Start with Atlanta, the downtown branch. I need every loan processed there in the last 12 months. Compare approval rates between white and black applicants. If there's a disparity, I want exact numbers. Then I want a deep dive into Mark Holloway's approvals and denials. Who he's fast-tracking, who he's stalling, and why. Decker hesitated just a second too long. Understood, he finally said. Do you want this report to remain internal, or should I flag it for board review? Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. Keep it internal for now. And Decker, I want a preliminary report by tonight. Yes, ma'am. She ended the call, letting the phone rest in her lap. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Cars inching through intersections, pedestrians lost in their own worlds. But inside the vehicle, it was silent. The kind of silence that preceded a storm. She turned to the window, watching as a young black woman in business attire walked past, her phone pressed to her ear. For a fleeting second, she thought of Angela Brooks, waiting, hoping, trying to keep faith in a system that was designed to fail her. Victoria had spent her career fighting against barriers, tearing down walls that weren't meant to be crossed. But what if the walls had simply been rebuilt when she wasn't looking? The thought sent a slow, simmering frustration through her veins. That night, as she sat in her hotel suite, her phone buzzed with an incoming email. She opened the report, and there it was. The numbers didn't just suggest bias, they screamed it. Loan denial rates for black applicants at the downtown Atlanta branch were 45% higher than for white applicants. Even when financial profiles were nearly identical, white applicants were approved 3 times faster. And Mark Holloway? His approvals skewed almost entirely toward wealthy, white clients. Meanwhile, applicants of color, many of whom had the financial backing, business history, and credit scores to qualify, were being delayed, ignored, or outright rejected. Victoria stared at the figures, feeling something cold settle in her chest. This wasn't an accident. This was a system. She let the screen dim, setting the phone aside as she leaned back against the plush hotel chair. The anger was there, coiled like a snake, waiting to strike. But she didn't let it consume her. Not yet. She had been in this game long enough to know one truth. You don't win by making noise. You win by making moves. So she would wait. She would collect every piece of evidence, expose every lie, pull every hidden thread, and when the time was right, she would bring the entire structure down. She turned back to the window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. The city lights flickered, oblivious to the battle that was brewing. A slow, knowing smile touched her lips. He doesn't know who I am, she murmured. But soon, this entire bank will. Victoria sat at the desk in her hotel suite, the dim glow of the laptop screen illuminating the stack of documents in front of her. She had spent the past 2 hours combing through the report from Decker's team, analyzing the data line by line. The disparities weren't just evident, they were staggering. Loan applications from black customers were being delayed by an average of 68% longer than those of white applicants. Approval rates for white clients with similar financial profiles were nearly double that of black clients. The worst offender? The downtown Atlanta branch. The numbers told a story of exclusion disguised as policy. Victoria leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingertips together. This wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate discrimination. And Mark Holloway? He wasn't just complicit. He was orchestrating it. She picked up her phone and dialed. A deep voice answered. Langston and Company Legal. Andrew, it's Victoria. A slight pause, then a shift in tone. What can I do for you, ma'am? I need a full compliance check on the Atlanta branches, she said. I want every policy, every internal directive related to loan approvals reviewed. Cross-check them against federal and state anti-discrimination laws. Andrew DeWitt was good at his job, one of the best attorneys on her legal team. He didn't waste time questioning why she was asking. You suspect something? I don't suspect. I know, Victoria replied, eyes scanning the report once more. I just need to prove it in a way that'll hold up when I take this to the board. I'll pull everything, he assured her. If there's a legal violation, we'll find it. Victoria exhaled. Good, I'll be in touch. She ended the call and closed her laptop. The next step wasn't legal, it was tactical. The numbers gave her evidence. Now she needed faces. She was going back to that branch. And this time, she wasn't just watching. The following morning, Victoria walked through the glass doors of the bank, dressed in the same understated clothing as before. She made her way toward the main waiting area, taking a seat within view of the tellers, but out of immediate focus. Angela Brooks was still there. The woman sat with her hands folded over a folder of documents, her expression carefully neutral, but the slight tension in her posture told Victoria everything she needed to know. She was exhausted, mentally, emotionally. 3 months of waiting, 3 months of hope stretched thin. Victoria took out her phone, holding it in her lap, and discreetly pressed record. She watched as another white client, a woman in her 40s, approached the teller. The interaction was smooth. No long waits, no extra questions. Within minutes, she was smiling, shaking hands, and walking out with her approval paperwork in hand. Angela, still waiting. Victoria turned her attention to Mark Holloway. He stood near the private offices, chatting easily with one of the senior tellers, completely unaware that he was being documented. A part of her wanted to confront him right then and there, but she held back. Not yet. Then something unexpected happened. As she glanced back toward the service counter, a small folded piece of paper slid onto the table beside her. She turned slightly. James Carter, the young teller she had noticed before, was at the adjacent counter, pretending to organize some forms. He kept his head down, but his fingers tapped twice on the desk, a silent signal. Victoria picked up the note and unfolded it under the table. If you want to know the truth, meet me after closing. She folded the paper again, slipping it into her pocket. Then she smiled. Finally, someone inside was ready to talk. The coffee shop was quiet, the kind of place where people came to read, not to talk. A soft jazz tune played in the background, blending into the faint clatter of cups and spoons. Victoria sat at a small table near the window, her back straight, fingers loosely wrapped around a cup of black coffee. She glanced at her watch. 6:42 p.m. James Carter was late. She didn't blame him. It wasn't easy deciding to talk. It was even harder following through. A few minutes later, the door opened, and James stepped inside. His movements were tense, his gaze darting around the room before settling on her. He hesitated for a beat, then walked over. Miss Langston, he greeted, his voice low. Victoria motioned to the seat across from her. Sit. James did, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like he was grounding himself. He looked nervous, more than nervous. He looked like a man who knew he was about to cross a line he could never come back from. Victoria let the silence settle before speaking. You wouldn't have reached out if you weren't ready. So talk. James exhaled, rubbing his palms together. I don't know where to start. Start with Mark Holloway. James flinched at the name but nodded. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Mark doesn't just run this branch. He controls it. And not just the operations, he controls who gets what. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Explain. James swallowed hard. He has a system. 2 lists, one for priority customers and one for the others. The others? James sighed. Black and Latino applicants, small business owners who don't have the right connections, people he decides aren't worth the risk. Victoria's grip on her coffee cup tightened, but she kept her face impassive. So what happens to them? James glanced around, then leaned in further. If you're on the priority list, white, wealthy, or tied to one of Mark's contacts, your loans get processed fast. No extra paperwork. No waiting. If you're not, he shook his head. He finds ways to stall, requests unnecessary documents, runs credit checks again and again, even when the first one clears. The goal is simple. Make it so difficult that people give up. Victoria let that sink in. It was one thing to suspect it. It was another to hear it confirmed by someone inside. Everyone in the bank knows this? She asked. James nodded. Yeah, but no one says anything. Not out loud. Why? James let out a dry laugh. Because Mark is untouchable. He's got the numbers to back him up. Profits are strong, default rates are low, and on paper everything looks fine. If anyone questions him, he reminds them who signs their paycheck. Victoria studied him for a long moment. So why are you talking now? James exhaled slowly. Because I'm tired. I'm tired of watching good people get turned away while others waltz in and get whatever they ask for. I've seen customers break down in tears because they can't get funding to keep their businesses open. Meanwhile, some rich guy with half the credentials walks in and walks out with a check. He clenched his jaw. And I've been part of it, even when I didn't want to be. For the first time, Victoria saw something beyond fear in his expression. Shame. She took a slow sip of her coffee, then set it down carefully. What do you have for me? James reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. He hesitated before sliding it across the table. This is everything. Victoria opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Loan application logs, denial rates, approval patterns. The data matched the internal report she already had. But this was from inside. This was proof no one could ignore. She flipped to the last page, a list of names, customers who had been denied without justification. Angela Brooks's name was right there. Victoria closed the folder and met James's gaze. You realize what this means, don't you? James nodded. I do. Mark Holloway's career is over the moment I use this. James licked his lips, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. I don't care anymore. I've been quiet too long. Victoria studied him for another beat, then smiled slightly. Good, she said, because I'm about to make him pay for every single name on this list. James let out a breath, his shoulders slumping slightly in relief. Victoria took another sip of her coffee, already planning her next move. Mark Holloway didn't know it yet, but his time was up. Victoria sat at the desk in her hotel room, her eyes scanning the documents spread out before her. The dim glow of the desk lamp cast shadows over the papers, cold, unfeeling numbers that told a damning story. 45% higher rejection rates for Black applicants. Expedited approvals for white clients with weaker financial credentials. A secret priority list curated by Mark Holloway himself. She exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. This wasn't just discrimination. It was a systemic operation, a calculated effort to suppress financial opportunities for entire communities. She tapped her fingers against the desk, considering her next move. The evidence was airtight. James Carter's internal files confirmed everything the audit had already suggested, but facts on paper wouldn't be enough. She needed impact. Victoria picked up her phone and dialed a number she rarely used. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. Langston and Company Internal Audit. Simon, it's Victoria, she said, her voice sharp with purpose. A brief silence. Then, what can I do for you, ma'am? I need an immediate compliance investigation into the downtown Atlanta branch. Full scale. I want to know every detail about their lending practices, and I want it on record. Simon didn't hesitate. Consider it done. How deep do you want us to dig? As deep as it takes, Victoria replied. I'm sending you files now. Cross-check them with our official approval reports. I want to know exactly how many federal regulations they violated. She could hear Simon typing. Understood. Anything else? Yes. She paused. This stays internal until I say otherwise. There was a brief hesitation before he answered. Of course. She ended the call and exhaled, setting the phone down. The investigation was in motion, but that wasn't enough. Victoria needed something louder. The next morning, she stepped through the doors of the downtown Atlanta branch, this time with a different energy. The subtle deference that employees gave white customers was absent in how they greeted her. The glances were curious, suspicious, wary. They had noticed her before, but now they were paying attention. She didn't wait in line. She walked straight to the service counter. The room hushed slightly, tension thickening as her presence registered across the space. From his office, Mark Holloway saw her. His smirk returned as he stepped out, adjusting his cuffs as he approached. You again, he drawled. I was beginning to think you had finally taken a hint. Victoria tilted her head slightly. I don't take hints, Mark. I take action. His smile didn't waver. Well, I'd hate to waste more of your time. So let me say it plainly. We reserve the right to deny transactions at our discretion. You're not entitled to anything here. A murmur ran through the bank. Customers had turned their heads now, their attention fully locked onto the conversation. Victoria held his gaze, then slowly reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a single tap, she pressed play. The audio filled the air. Mark's own voice, clear and unmistakable. If she gives up, we don't have to take the risk. That's the goal. Make them walk away on their own. Silence fell. A shift rippled through the room. The tellers at their stations froze, exchanging uncertain glances. A few customers sat forward in their seats, brows furrowing in confusion, then recognition. Angela Brooks, who had been seated near the back, stood. Mark's smirk faltered. This, he shook his head, forcing a chuckle. This is nothing. A recording taken out of context doesn't prove anything. Victoria slid her phone back into her bag. It's not just a recording. It's a pattern, a system, and in 24 hours, your entire operation is going under review. His expression tightened. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. You have until tomorrow to enjoy this office, Mark, because after that, you won't be standing here anymore. Mark swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. Victoria turned on her heel and walked out, the weight of every watching eye pressing down behind her. The storm was coming, and Mark Holloway had nowhere to hide. Mark Holloway paced back and forth in his office, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His grip on it was tense, knuckles white with frustration. The blinds were drawn, shutting out the world outside, but he could feel the pressure closing in. This is bad, Mark, a voice on the other end said. If this investigation goes public, we're looking at lawsuits, federal scrutiny. This could destroy the entire division. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his pulse pounding. That's why we need to stop it before it gets that far. I need you to talk to the board. Tell them this can still be contained. A pause. You don't understand, the voice replied, quieter this time. Victoria Langston isn't backing down. She's got the evidence, and once she presents it, the board won't have a choice. Mark clenched his jaw, swallowing the anger rising in his throat. He had underestimated her. That much was clear. But he wasn't about to let this woman, this outsider, tear everything apart. He ended the call and dialed another number. This time, he didn't wait for pleasantries. We need to talk, he said as soon as Victoria picked up. There was a pause before she answered, her voice calm and composed. I'm listening. Mark sat down, rubbing his temple. Look, I get it. You want a clean house. I'm willing to step down if that's what it takes. But we don't need to make this a public execution. Let's handle this internally. Silence stretched between them for a moment before Victoria spoke. You still don't get it, do you? Mark frowned. What do you mean? I don't care about your resignation, she said evenly. This isn't just about you, Mark. It's about accountability. You stepping down doesn't fix the damage you've done. Mark's fingers curled into a fist. So you'd rather take down the whole system? If the system is built to discriminate, Victoria replied, then yes. The line went dead. Mark slammed the phone down, breathing heavily. He could feel the walls closing in, his grip on everything he had built slipping through his fingers. At the same time across the city, Victoria walked into the regional headquarters of Langston and Company, her steps steady and deliberate. The air in the conference room was thick with unease as she took her seat at the head of the table. Around her sat the bank's top executives, their faces tense, some expectant, others wary. Simon Decker, head of internal audit, cleared his throat. The preliminary findings confirm what we suspected: discriminatory lending patterns, manipulated approval processes, and enough federal violations to warrant serious consequences. A murmur rippled through the room. Victoria folded her hands on the table. We don't have the luxury of sweeping this under the rug. We take action now, or we face the consequences later. One of the senior board members, a man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive watch, shifted uncomfortably. Are we talking about firings? Policy overhauls? Victoria's gaze was unyielding. Both. There was silence, then a quiet voice at the end of the table. The head of legal counsel leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. And what about Holloway? Victoria's expression didn't change. He'll be dealt with accordingly. The conversation continued, strategies unfolding, plans being set. But in the back of her mind, she knew Mark Holloway wasn't going to go down quietly. As the meeting concluded, news began to spread. By the time Mark returned to his office, he could already feel the shift in the air. Employees whispered as he passed. His assistant looked at him with something close to pity, and when he turned on his computer, his inbox was flooded with messages, some from legal, some from board members, others from reporters who had caught wind of the growing scandal. His hands clenched into fists. This was happening too fast. He needed a way out. As he stared out the window, the city stretched before him in a blur of lights. He could feel the noose tightening, and then a thought crept in. A dangerous, desperate thought. If he was going down, he wasn't going down alone. Mark Holloway leaned back in his chair, his office dimly lit except for the glow of his computer screen. He had spent the last 2 hours making calls, pulling favors, and planting the seeds of his counterattack. He wasn't going to sit back and let Victoria Langston destroy him. If he was going down, he was taking her with him. He scrolled through the emails, scanning the drafts of articles that would be pushed out within the next few hours. Carefully crafted narratives, all designed to smear Victoria's name. Langston's crusade, a power grab disguised as justice? Did the CEO know? Sources say Victoria Langston ignored discrimination for years. Internal purge. Langston's campaign to eliminate rivals under the guise of reform. Mark smirked. Perception was everything. It didn't matter what the truth was. If he could plant enough doubt, if he could make people question Victoria's motives, he could shift the conversation. He picked up his phone and made one last call. Everything's in motion? He asked. A smooth voice on the other end replied, By morning, it'll be everywhere. Mark leaned forward, staring at the skyline outside his window. Good, he said. Let's see how untouchable she really is. The first article dropped before sunrise. By the time Victoria stepped into her office, her phone was already buzzing. The emails flooded in, urgent subject lines flashing across her screen. At first, she skimmed through them, expecting more updates on the investigation. But then she saw the headlines. Her jaw tightened. Within hours, the smear campaign had spread. News outlets were running segments questioning her intentions. The internet was ablaze with speculation. Some defended her, but others were falling right into Mark's trap. Her assistant stepped in, her face pale. You need to see this. She held out a tablet, a video already playing. A well-dressed commentator spoke with a serious expression. This scandal raises serious questions, he said. Is Victoria Langston really fighting for fairness? Or is she using this as an excuse to consolidate power within the company? Some sources suggest that she's known about these discriminatory practices for years and is only acting now to take down a rival. Victoria clenched her teeth. Then her phone rang. She answered without hesitation. We need to talk, a familiar voice said. It was one of the senior board members, his tone sharp. About what? Victoria asked, though she already knew. You've seen the new, he said. This is getting out of control. We can't afford this kind of exposure. Victoria exhaled through her nose. So what are you suggesting? There was a pause, then, pause the investigation. Let this blow over. A cold anger settled in her chest. You want me to back down? We want you to be strategic. If you keep pushing, it won't just be Holloway's reputation at stake. It'll be the entire bank's. Victoria gripped the phone tighter. And if I stop? Then we manage this internally. No further media exposure. We keep control of the narrative. She stared at the city skyline outside her window. She had expected backlash. She had expected resistance. But she hadn't expected her own people to fold so quickly. She took a slow breath. I appreciate your concern, she said, but I don't make decisions based on fear. Victoria, she ended the call. She knew what this meant. She wasn't just fighting Mark anymore. She was fighting an entire system that wanted to protect itself. That afternoon, an emergency board meeting was called. Victoria entered the conference room, her presence commanding, even as several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Some wouldn't meet her eyes. Others were clearly waiting for her to explain herself. Let's get straight to it, one of them said. This situation is spiraling. If we don't control it, we risk damaging the bank's reputation beyond repair. Victoria crossed her arms. The damage was already done the moment discrimination became part of our operations. The only difference now is that people are seeing it. Another executive spoke up, his tone measured. No one is saying we ignore the issue, Victoria. But if we don't approach this carefully, we could be putting the entire company in jeopardy. Victoria narrowed her eyes. What you're really saying is that it's easier to silence the truth than to fix the problem. Silence. She let her words settle before continuing. I'm not stopping this investigation. I won't pause it. I won't sweep it under the rug. And I won't let Mark Holloway walk away from what he's done. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Some looked impressed. Others looked furious. The chairman cleared his throat. Victoria, you have to consider the bigger picture. I am considering it, she interrupted, and that's exactly why I'm not backing down. She stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. You all have a choice to make, she said. You can either stand with me and fix this, or you can spend the next decade trying to recover from the fallout when the truth comes out anyway. No one spoke. Victoria turned and walked out of the room, her pulse steady. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the headlines again. Then she muttered under her breath, if they want a war, they'll get one. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. She was going to tear down the entire corrupt system, and nothing was going to stop her. The conference room at Langston and Company headquarters was packed. Rows of journalists, reporters, and industry analysts filled the space, their cameras aimed at the podium. The air buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another corporate press event. This was about something bigger. Victoria Langston stood behind the sleek wooden podium, her expression composed, her hands resting firmly on either side. The flashes of cameras flickered like lightning, but she didn't blink. She was ready. She scanned the crowd, meeting the gazes of those waiting for her to speak, some skeptical, some hopeful, some simply waiting to see if she would fold under the pressure. She wouldn't. She adjusted the microphone, then spoke, her voice steady and clear. Over the past several weeks, Langston and Company has been conducting an internal investigation into the lending practices within our institution. What we found is deeply troubling. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The room was silent. Victoria continued, her tone unwavering. Our investigation uncovered undeniable patterns of discrimination. Black and Latino customers, individuals, families, and small business owners have faced systemic barriers to financial access. Barriers that were not only unethical, but illegal. A murmur spread through the room. Journalists scribbled notes, cameras zoomed in closer. Victoria reached for the folder in front of her and lifted the first document. A large screen behind her flickered to life, displaying hard numbers. Undeniable proof. The data speaks for itself, she said. At one of our largest branches, Black applicants were denied loans 45% more often than their white counterparts, even when their financial profiles were identical. Latino applicants faced similar delays and denials. She let the numbers linger, allowing them to hit where they needed to. Then she reached for her phone, tapped a button, and the recording played. Mark Holloway's voice filled the room. If she gives up, we don't have to take the risk. That's the goal. Make them walk away on their own. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, the hurried clicking of camera shutters. The truth was now public. Victoria let the recording play in full before setting the phone down. This, she said, looking directly at the cameras, is what financial discrimination sounds like, and it was happening under my watch. She let that last sentence hang in the air. Then she shifted. This is not just about one man. This is about an entire system that allowed it to happen. The murmur in the room grew louder. Reporters exchanged looks. They had expected her to take down one corrupt executive, not to go after the entire structure. Victoria wasn't done. Effective immediately, we are making fundamental changes to how our bank operates. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the screen as a list of policy reforms appeared. Mandatory public reporting of loan approval rates by race and income level. No more hidden statistics. The public would see what was happening. Creation of an independent oversight committee, a group that would review all denied loan applications with potential bias. Immediate termination of any executive or manager found guilty of discriminatory practices, not just at one branch, across the entire banking system. She let the policies sink in before delivering the final blow. We will be working closely with civil rights organizations and legal experts to ensure compliance. And anyone who resists these changes, she paused, they will no longer have a place in this institution. Silence. Then the room erupted. Questions flew from every direction. When will these changes take effect? Are you firing Mark Holloway? Will other branches be investigated? Victoria lifted a hand and the room settled. I understand the weight of this moment, she said. Trust is earned, not given. We failed too many people for too long. But I can promise you this, the way things were is not the way they will be. As the press conference neared its end, a reporter at the front raised her hand. Mrs. Langston, she called, standing, you've made bold promises today. But do you really believe this system can change? Or will things eventually go back to the way they were? Victoria held the woman's gaze, then smiled. This isn't just about changing policies. It's about changing power. And power doesn't shift overnight. It shifts when people refuse to let things return to the way they were. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but unshakable. This is just the beginning. The boardroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. A long mahogany table stretched across the room, lined with the most powerful executives of Langston and Company. The tension was thick, a weight pressing down on everyone seated inside. Mark Holloway sat near the center, his usual arrogance dimmed but not extinguished. His hands were clasped together on the table, his jaw locked tight. He was trying to appear composed, but the sweat gathering at his temple betrayed him. At the head of the table, Victoria Langston remained standing. She didn't need to sit. She owned this room now. Across from her, some of the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Others leaned back in their chairs, distancing themselves from the storm about to hit. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to choose sides too soon. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. Mr. Holloway, he began, his voice measured, you've been called here today to answer for the allegations against you. Mark scoffed, shaking his head. Allegations, he muttered under his breath. Victoria didn't let the moment pass. They're not allegations, she said evenly. They're facts, and they're staring you in the face. Mark turned to her, his smirk flickering back, though weaker than before. And what? You think you're the hero here? He let out a dry chuckle. Let's be honest, Victoria. You and I both know this goes beyond me. If I go down, I'm taking others with me. The room tensed. Some of the board members stiffened, afraid of how deep this could go. Victoria didn't blink. I don't need to prove you were the only one, she said. I just need to prove you were the worst one. With that, she placed a thick folder on the table and slid it forward. The room held its breath. One of the legal advisors, a sharp-eyed woman in a gray suit, reached for the documents first. She flipped through the pages, her expression tightening as she read. Slowly, she placed one of the sheets down for the board to see. Victoria spoke as the words sank in. These are the final findings of the internal audit, she said, her voice calm but merciless. They show exactly how you manipulated the approval process. You skewed the system in favor of clients who benefited you financially. You deliberately denied funding to Black and Latino customers, not because they were unqualified, but because you didn't want them in your portfolio. She stepped forward. And here's the part that should really concern you. She slid another document across the table. It was an email, one Mark himself had sent, ordering branch managers to deny loans to Black applicants without providing justification. A murmur broke out across the room. The chairman frowned deeply. One of the other board members, who had been avoiding eye contact this entire time, finally spoke up. This, this is serious, he muttered. If this gets out, Victoria cut him off. It's already out. Mark stiffened. She turned to him, and in a final, devastating move, she pulled out her phone and hit play. James Carter's voice filled the room. Mark Holloway told us that if we approved too many black applicants, we'd be watering down the client base. He said they'd be too risky, that we should make them jump through hoops until they gave up. The silence that followed was absolute. Mark paled. His hands, still clasped, were trembling now. Victoria let the weight of it settle before delivering the final blow. This isn't just unethical, she said, her voice sharp as steel. It's illegal. And as of this morning, our legal team has initiated full cooperation with federal regulators. The room exploded. Board members whispered furiously among themselves, some leaning forward, others leaning back in resignation. Mark looked around wildly. His carefully constructed world was collapsing. This is absurd, he finally burst out. You think you can pin this all on me? If I go down, I'll make sure you all go down with me. He turned to the chairman. You knew about this, he hissed. You all knew. I wasn't the only one benefiting from this system. But now there was no one left to defend him. The chairman rubbed his temples. Enough, Mark. Mark's nostrils flared. You can't just... I said enough. The chairman's voice was final. He let out a breath, then turned to Victoria. What are your recommendations? Victoria didn't hesitate. Immediate termination, she said. Effective today. Mark Holloway let out a sharp laugh. You think that's enough? He snapped. You think firing me fixes this? No, Victoria said. That's why the rest of you will be under investigation too. The ripple of fear through the room was palpable. Victoria continued, her tone unwavering. Any executive found complicit in this will be held accountable. This system ends today. The chairman nodded. Then it's decided. Mark stared at them all, his face flushed with fury. You're making a mistake, he spat. No, Mark, Victoria said quietly. You did. Security was called to escort him out. Outside, the Atlanta air was thick and humid. Mark stepped out of the headquarters, the weight of what had just happened crushing him. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. But he didn't stop. Then just before getting into his car, he turned back. Victoria stood by the glass doors watching. He met her gaze, his eyes dark with rage. You think you won? He sneered. This system isn't going to change. It's too deep, too big. You can cut me out, but the machine will keep running. Victoria didn't look away. You're right, she said. But I'm not stopping here. Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head before stepping into his car and slamming the door shut. As the engine revved, Victoria exhaled slowly. A week had passed since Mark Holloway walked out of Langston and Company for the last time. But his absence wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning of something much bigger. Inside the bank's headquarters, changes were already taking shape. New policies were being drafted, new oversight committees were being formed, and new expectations were being set. Victoria sat in her office, scrolling through the latest compliance reports. For the first time, the numbers were shifting. Loan approval rates for minority applicants were beginning to balance out. The days of hidden discrimination, of endless roadblocks and unexplained denials were numbered. She exhaled slowly. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a start. At the downtown Atlanta branch, Angela Brooks walked through the doors for the first time without hesitation. She wasn't here to plead her case. She wasn't here to wait hours for an answer she already knew. This time, she was here to finalize her loan. The teller at the counter smiled as she approached. Ms. Brooks, we have your documents ready, the woman said, sliding a neatly prepared folder across the desk. Your loan has been approved. Angela blinked, as if waiting for the catch, the extra request, the unnecessary delay, the excuse. But it never came. She took a slow breath, picked up the pen, and signed the papers. A weight lifted off her shoulders. As she gathered her things, she turned and spotted Victoria standing nearby. Victoria had been watching from a distance, arms crossed, observing as the system finally did what it was supposed to do. Angela walked over, her expression a mix of gratitude and something deeper, a quiet understanding between two women who had fought different battles against the same enemy. "I didn't think I'd see the day," Angela said, tucking the papers into her bag. Victoria gave a small nod. "It took too long," she admitted, "but it's happening now." Angela smiled, then held out her hand. "Thank you." Victoria shook it firmly. "This isn't just for you," she said. "This is for everyone who walked in here and didn't get the same opportunity." Angela nodded. "I hope it lasts." Victoria's gaze darkened slightly, but she didn't let it show. "So do I." That night, back in New York, Victoria sat at her desk, reviewing the latest updates on the bank's restructuring. Everything seemed to be moving forward, until her inbox pinged. She glanced at the subject line of the email. "Urgent. We have a problem." Frowning, she clicked it open. The message was from an anonymous employee. "Mark Holloway may be gone, but some of his allies are still here. A senior executive is working behind the scenes to block parts of your reform plan. They're trying to keep the old system intact, just quieter, harder to detect. You need to act before it's too late." Victoria stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. It wasn't over. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled together. Outside, the city lights stretched for miles. The financial system still pulsed, still thrived, still protected the people who had built it to serve only themselves. Victoria had taken down one man, but the system was still standing. She stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the skyline. She had fought too hard to let this slip through the cracks. She had no intention of stopping now. A slow, knowing smile crossed her lips. "I took down a pawn," she murmured, "but this game isn't over." She turned away from the window, already reaching for her phone. Because if they thought she would stop here, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Victoria sat at her desk, staring at the email on her screen. It was short, to the point, and exactly what she had feared. Mark Holloway was gone, but the resistance wasn't. She read it again. "Some executives are deliberately stalling your reforms. Loan approvals in certain branches are still being slowed down. The system is resisting you. From the inside." Victoria inhaled deeply, her fingers drumming against the desk. She had expected backlash, but she hadn't thought it would come so soon, or so quietly. The problem wasn't just Mark. It never had been. The system didn't rely on one man. It thrived on a network of silent enablers, people who had benefited from the way things had always been. Mark's removal had been a shockwave, but now the real challenge began. They weren't fighting in the open. They were working in the shadows. Victoria wouldn't allow it. By midday, she had called an emergency board meeting. Executives and senior managers gathered around the long glass table, their expressions ranging from curious to wary. The energy in the room was different this time. Less fear, more resistance. Victoria stood at the head of the table, waiting for silence. When she spoke, her voice was calm but sharp. "I've reviewed the latest reports," she said, "and I have one question." She placed a folder onto the table. "Why are loan approvals for minority applicants still being delayed in multiple branches?" The room stiffened. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. A man near the end of the table, Richard Caldwell, a senior executive with decades in the company, cleared his throat. "Victoria, I think we need to be careful about assuming intent. Some of these delays could be procedural." Victoria cut him off. "They're not." She tapped the folder in front of her. "These numbers show that in some branches, approval rates have barely changed since we started these reforms. And in others, they've gotten worse." Silence. Richard sighed, leaning back. "Look, we all want fairness, but we can't ignore the risk factors involved in lending. If we start approving loans just to meet quotas," Victoria's eyes flashed, "that's not what this is about, and you know it." A few murmurs ran through the room, but no one spoke up. She continued, "This isn't about quotas. This is about a system that was designed to work for some and against others. And some of you are trying to keep it that way." Now the tension thickened. A woman across the table, Allison Pierce, folded her arms. "Victoria, let's be realistic. We can't overhaul decades of policy overnight. And let's be honest, if we push too hard, we could lose valuable clients. We need balance." Victoria met her gaze unwavering. Balance, she repeated. You mean comfort. You're afraid of alienating the clients who've always had the advantage. Allison said nothing. Victoria straightened. Let me be very clear. This is not a request. This is happening. Any executive found deliberately slowing down these changes will be removed. Richard let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Removed? He shook his head. You can't just fire people who disagree with you, Victoria. I don't fire people for disagreeing. Her voice was cool, unwavering. I fire people for standing in the way of progress. The room fell silent. The meeting ended in uneasy tension. Some executives left quickly, avoiding eye contact. Others lingered, whispering to one another. Victoria stayed seated, reviewing the documents again, her focus unshaken. Then a shadow fell over the table. She looked up. It was Richard Caldwell. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. You can change a few things, he said, his tone almost amused. But you won't change everything. The system has existed too long. You're fighting something bigger than you. Victoria held his gaze, unreadable. Then she stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. We'll see. She walked past him without looking back. As she reached the door, she murmured under her breath, I'm not here to change a few things. She pushed the door open, stepping into the hallway. I'm here to change everything. A year had passed. The financial industry had shifted in ways that many thought impossible. The reforms that Victoria Langston had implemented at Langston and Company had rippled outward, forcing other banks to take notice, regulators to step in the old ways to crumble, slowly but surely. Some executives had left. Others had been removed. The ones who remained had no choice but to adapt. And the numbers told the story. Across the country, loan approval rates for Black and Latino applicants had risen significantly. The barriers that had once made financial stability nearly impossible for minority-owned businesses were beginning to erode. In the Atlanta branch, the waiting rooms looked different. No more invisible lines separating the preferred clients from those deemed lesser. No more unfair denials. No more hidden policies designed to discourage people from seeking what they had every right to receive. The system wasn't perfect, but for the first time, it was changing. Victoria sat in her office, reviewing the latest report from the oversight committee she had fought so hard to establish. The findings were clear. Things were working. There were still obstacles, of course. Some branches had required more aggressive restructuring. Some managers had resisted until the very last moment, but the fight had been worth it. She leaned back in her chair, letting herself breathe for a moment. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up. Angela Brooks stood there smiling. Victoria waved her in. You look different, she noted. More confident. Angela stepped inside, holding up a check. This, she said, is the final installment on my business loan. Paid in full. Victoria raised an eyebrow. So the system actually worked? Angela let out a small laugh. For once. She sat down across from Victoria. But it's not just me. Other business owners, people who never would have had a chance before, they're getting loans now. They're expanding. They're hiring. It's happening, Victoria. What you did, it's real. Victoria took the check from Angela's hands, studying it. The name of the bank was printed clearly at the top. Her bank. She nodded slowly, placing it down on her desk. Angela hesitated before speaking again. Do you feel like it's enough? Victoria considered the question. It's a start. Angela's expression softened. You never really stop, do you? Victoria smirked. Would you? Angela shook her head, standing. No, she admitted. I wouldn't. She extended her hand. Thank you. Victoria took it, shaking firmly. Don't thank me, she said. Make sure no one ever takes this away from you. Angela smiled, squeezing her hand once before heading toward the door. Victoria watched her go, then let out a slow breath. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in her career, she could say with certainty, it had been worth it. Her phone rang. Victoria picked it up, glancing at the unknown number. She answered, her voice composed. Langston, a deep voice greeted her. Mrs. Langston, this is David Monroe from the Treasury Department. She straightened slightly. What can I do for you? There was a pause before Monroe spoke again. You changed your bank, he said. Now we want to know, how would you feel about changing the entire financial system? Victoria blinked. We're forming a national financial oversight committee, Monroe continued. We need leaders who understand both the power and the pitfalls of the industry. People who aren't afraid to disrupt the system. He let the offer sit for a moment before adding, we'd like you to be part of it. Victoria leaned back, considering. She had never envisioned herself stepping into that world. She had spent so much of her life fighting from within her own corporation, tearing down the walls from the inside. Now they wanted her to reshape the system from the top. She exhaled, standing from her desk and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window. The skyline stretched before her. New York, vast and endless. This wasn't just about one bank. It never had been. She closed her eyes for a second, then reopened them, the decision already forming. She brought the phone back to her ear. I'm listening, she said. Monroe chuckled. Good. Because this fight is bigger than you think. Victoria allowed herself a small smile. Then it sounds like I'm exactly where I need to be. She ended the call, her reflection staring back at her in the window. The war wasn't over, but she had just won the first battle, and she was only getting started. Power isn't just about holding a title, it's about what you do when the system is designed to keep others out. Victoria Langston didn't just fight for herself, she fought for everyone who had ever been denied a chance. Not because they weren't qualified, but because they weren't the right kind of client. And in doing so, she proved one thing. Real change doesn't come from waiting, it comes from demanding it. But here's the real question. Do you think one person can truly change an entire system? Or is the fight against injustice a battle that never really ends? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, stories of power, resilience, and justice, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what comes next.